Everyone to a episode of Executive Health and Life. I'm your host, Julian Hayes II, back at it again. And if you're watching the replay on any of these different medium channels that it is being broadcast on, welcome. Thank you for joining me. This is a fascinating discussion. I've had this guest on a little over 2 years ago when I was first getting started in podcasting. So I guess I made a decent enough impression that he decided to come back. So I'm speaking with none other than Michael Lustgarten, and he is a scientist in the nutrition, exercise physiology, sarcopenia laboratory at the Human Nutrition Research on Aging. Michael, how's it going, man?
Good, Julian. Good to see you.
Good to see you, man. Yeah, we were talking a little bit. It's been like 2 years, and I was like, you came on, you look a little more in shape and everything. So, you've been aging backwards, practicing what you preach.
Yeah, I don't know about aging backwards, but trying to slow it down, as much as possible. So
Yeah, so mentioning aging backwards and everything. Let's go ahead and start with that. So current age and then biological age, because if you remember last time we talked, this was very new about the biological age thing, and so a lot of developments have happened since then. So have you dived into? Well, I know you've dived into it. So what have you learned from that?
yeah, so I'm going to be 50 chronologically in January, but there are two biological age tests that I commonly use, or I commonly make YouTube videos about. Dr. Morgan Levine's phenotypic age, and then aging.ai. So they're not identical. They're somewhat different in terms of the biomarkers that they measure. Nonetheless, when I use the Levine test, prior to this year, my average reduction for chronological age minus biological age was about 12 years. So in other words, the test was showing that the biomarkers were showing that I was 12 years younger than my chronological age. But then, so I've been tracking my diet since 2015. So in gathering all that diet, and basically it's a trial and error process to figure out which diet approach, even how much physical activity I should be doing, all of that factors into my approach. I've been titrating it better in 2022, such that my biological age using the Levine test is now about 15 years younger. And I've measured my blood tests. I've done blood tests 6 times in 2020. So, and then similar data with the other biological age metric. But I've even expanded beyond that and started measuring my epigenetic age too. I have 3 tests with that. And then even beyond the blood, a lot of people think it's too cutesy, even though this is peer reviewed. These are peer reviewed metrics. It's not just some stupid questionnaire you fill out and, what are your health habits? Even taking a step beyond that, there are blind spots on these blood biomarkers, so they're derived from big populations, and in the big populations, you have only so many blood biomarkers, or, maybe you don't have blood pressure or lung function. So I've expanded my approach to track those things too, to try to cover as many organ systems as possible and try to optimize as many things as possible, no weak links. Yeah, and that's just the beginning of it. I've got a lot more than that. So
Yeah, I'm kind of there with you. Even though your meticulous tracking is uncomparable. You are the Michael Jordan of that.
well, I wish that were true, and I'm happy to say that there are other people who are doing this and potentially as rigorous or more rigorous than me. So one that I don't know if you're familiar with is Brian Johnson, and he basically blew up on Twitter over the last week. He's a little bit leaner than I am right now, and he may be chronologically younger than me, but he's got a thing called Blueprint where he tracks a whole bunch of variables. I think his epigenetic age may be a little bit better than mine, but he doesn't post all of his blood biomarker data, but his attitude is basically very similar to mine, where people will actually come at him sideways and be like, this is an eating disorder. What you're doing is excessive. Yeah, for you. But for me, this is what makes me feel at my best, literally, physically, mentally, emotionally, everywhere. And I've seen him, say similar things. So I'm not the only one. It's a small but growing, rigorous tracking group.
I'm with you on that. And, for me, it's like, how much can I push my body? And because I've gotten into distance training as well over the last year, and then then lifting weights as well. And so a lot of people say that's excessively training and everything. And so I'm really curious on matching, longevity with performance, because a lot of times, too often you hear the people in the anti-aging longevity space, it's about just lifting maybe 3 times a week, and it's but it's not really experiencing life. And so I did my epigenetic age test, and I'm going to improve on it. So I'm 6 years younger
Well,
than.
wait. They're not all the same. All the epigenetic tests aren't the
Oh,
same.
I did think I used I think it was a true age.
True age. I don't know
It's
what that test is.
it's
I
just,
know that they offer an epigenetic test,
mhm.
but true age, it's not true diagnostic, right? It's a true age
No,
through
it's
a,
true diagnostic. Sorry,
ah,
true diagnostic. Yeah, sorry,
cool.
true diagnostic. Yeah.
But they offer 3 different epigenetic tests. So which one was 6 years younger?
So I did all of them, and so you have the let's see, we have the what's the
Horvath? Oh, IEAA?
yeah, we have the Horvath, and we have the
Hannum?
no, not the Hannum, and then
Dunedin Pace?
yes, we have that too.
Yeah.
So I did that as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I'm aging. I think it was maybe for every year I'm aging about 3/4 of that.
0.75. Nice. That's
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So what about the other 2 tests?
The intrinsic. Let's see. I think extrinsic. There's an extrinsic age and intrinsic age, right?
Yep.
I believe the extrinsic was like 25,
What's your chronological age?
36.
11 years younger. Good,
Yeah,
good, good, good.
yeah.
And then the first?
They and then the intrinsic was I think at 30.
So yeah, that's great data.
Yeah.
Actually my intrinsic, that's the Horvath test, is
Mhm.
terrible in my case. It was I think 4 years older, 5 years older, and then 7 years older on this test
Hmm.
that I just got done. Yeah, so I don't know what's going on there, but the extrinsic, 12 years younger, 12 years younger, 10 years younger, and then Dunedin Pace, it was 0.8,
Mhm.
0.82, and then my worst data on my last test, 0.89. But still relatively good
Mhm.
news, right?
Yeah,
So
see, I'm curious to when I do this test again after I've done all this excessive training and see if that has any effect
yeah.
on the rate of aging and everything. Because you can over exercise.
Yeah, for sure. That's a big part of my I don't know if you want to go down that rabbit hole, but that's a big part of my approach too in terms of
We can start there. Yeah, let's go ahead and start there.
yeah. Well, wait, just one last thing. My Horvath data, the intrinsic is terrible, but there aren't many randomized controlled trials that show what can actually improve it. For me, exercise is a given. I've been doing that,
Mhm.
since I'm my teens. Like I'm not inactive. I have a standard exercise program, weightlifting, all the things, right? But that my Horvath is so terrible. Now that I have 3 tests, I'm going to keep measuring it. And it's only a matter of time before I have enough data, like all of my other blood test data, where I'm going to see, all right, these things are correlated. Now let me try to change these things in my diet or whatever it may be. I may have to take supplements. I don't know. We'll see. But all right. So physical activity, right? So
Mhm.
exercise is well known to improve average, but not maximal lifespan. This is like well established. So um, there's about a 10-year or so gain for average in people. But when you look at maximal lifespan, which right now the record is 122 years, where are the marathon runners? Where are the bodybuilders or fitness-minded athletes? It doesn't exist, right? So there's something about exercise that's simultaneously good for health to get you, to have an increased health span beyond the average, but potentially also simultaneously bad that it doesn't allow us to get to the maximal and beyond. And actually, that's how I got started in this thing because I was reading like the bodybuilding magazines when I was like a teenager and a pre-teenager. And I was like, that makes sense to me that if I'm ripped and lean and fit and functional, I'm going to live forever. How can I die? Right. But that's just not the case. So there's more to the story. So how can we titrate the amount of activity that can, basically kill 2 birds with 1 stone, increase the maximum and potentially increase the average and potentially get to the maximum. So before I go into that, are you a sports fan, a baseball fan?
Sports fan. So I don't watch sports too much, but a little bit into basketball and football.
All
And,
right.
and and I guess a little soccer or football for
All
my
right.
international audience.
So I've got an analogy that works best with baseball. So I don't know
Okay,
if it'll
I can follow.
So it used to be like in the 70s and 80s that the starting pitcher would throw 250 innings, a workhorse, right? And then somewhere along the lines after that, pitching changed where they started to reduce the workload of these workhorses with the idea that they'll reduce injury risk. So now these starting pitchers that are pitching in the majors now rarely go to 200 innings, and the majority of starting pitchers don't even get anywhere close to that. So then there are other pitchers who throw 60 innings relative to the 250. And if they throw more than 60 innings, their injury risk increases. So what I'm trying to say is in baseball for pitching, there are workhorses, but then there are also people who are more specialized in that if they go beyond a certain limit, they seem to have an increased injury risk. I think the same thing is true in exercise. Whether it's, what's excessive exercise, we can't apply that broad stroke to everybody. So how can we titrate that? So mentally, I've always had the workhorse mentality. Like my workouts would be 2 to 3 hour weightlifting workouts. I'm throwing around heavy stuff like a gorilla. That's what I like to do. Like I've always liked to do that. But when I first started tracking metrics of cardiovascular fitness, the heart rate variability and resting heart rate, my data was terrible. Without going into the numbers, I shouldn't say it's terrible, but it wasn't what I expected based on how active that I was. So over the past 4+ years, I've been tracking those metrics, and I can see, if I go above a certain amount of physical activity, and this isn't in steps, if you walk 1,000 steps on a flat land, that's not the same as going up 1,000 steps up a hill, but your step counter will say 1,000 steps. So tracking your heart rate, your average daily heart rate every day, and then seeing, or at least this is what I do, seeing, where's the range where it best optimizes my cardiovascular fitness metrics. Because when those metrics aren't optimized, I see things like higher inflammation in my data, like when I've done finger prick blood testing. So now, interestingly, I was overtrained. When I first started tracking these things, I was dramatically overtrained. And now, like, I've cut my workouts down. I've even cut down the amounts of sets and reps, even how much weight that I was doing, to try to get in my activity, my quote unquote, my optimal activity zone. Now, it won't be like that for everyone, but I'd imagine that everyone can find that physical activity zone that best optimizes not only strength, mobility, balance, all that stuff, but also the cardiovascular fitness metrics, which, is the last note, is a balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So overtrained, you're basically frying your engine, and, undertrained doing the same thing. So
yes, and that's the thing. My critical lesson in learning that is that what I had to do, because at first I was severely overtraining myself, and my metrics are showing that as well. And so I had to, the more activity I did, the more activities I had to do in terms of recovery, just to bring it back to that equilibrium balance that you're talking about. So I had to not skip on my stretching and mobility work every day. Also look at things like the sauna has really helped me. Contrast showers has helped me. And then I also had to sleep more. And I can get by on basically 6.5 hours now. But if I'm going to train as much as I do, then I had to add even more sleep on top of that. And so, that gets me. So I was checking out a couple of videos before, and this was news to my ears because I saw a study. You talked about the optimal BMI. And so my BMI is a little over 27. And you remember there was a study where you talked about people over a BMI of 27 had a higher life expectancy.
yeah.
And my thing about that is, though, there's different types of BMIs at 28 and 27. Mine's going to look a lot different than a lot of people. And so what do you think about that?
Yeah. So in my early days on my website, I focused on BMI. So it's been a few years since I posted that there, that published data on the BMI all-cause mortality risk. I don't pay too much attention to BMI. It's almost like, you could ask the same question: what's the optimal diet, right? Should I be vegan, vegetarian, carnivore, etc., keto, right? And if for me, it comes down to the biomarkers. If you show me that your markers of kidney function, liver, lipid panel, glucose, insulin levels, inflammation, I mean, I can go down the list, right? If all of that looks good at a BMI of 27 or 20, what is the optimal BMI, for you at the individual level that is best associated with all of the biomarkers? So the epidemiological studies are nice. And oftentimes they give conflicting data, because one study will show BMI of like 23 is best, and another will show 27 and 80-year-olds is best. How can we go beyond that and see what's best at the individual level? And for me, it's, what's the full biomarker panel look like? And also, I've done correlation analysis, since body weight is one of the things I track every day. I've tracked that for at least 4 years, like every day religiously. So I can look at correlations between my diet with these full panel of blood biomarkers that represent many organ systems. And for me, having a relatively lower body weight is associated with, or significantly correlated with, more biomarkers going in the right direction than wrong in terms of how those biomarkers change with aging and all-cause mortality risk. Now, that may not be the case for everybody. It could be that at a BMI of 27, the majority of your biomarkers look great. But I recommend to everyone, that experimenting with body weight and body composition and seeing where your true best data is, rather than what's published in a study on other people,
Mhm.
may be the best road.
Yeah, that's all about the N of one.
Yep.
That's the world we live in. It's all about N of one. Now, I had a question. Someone left a question here, and I think I know the answer to this. And I have a part to add to that. And so it is: how many years on average do you suggest someone should track their metrics for fitness?
Yeah. Forever.
Okay,
Forever.
that's
Uh,
what I knew.
yeah.
Okay, and so the second part of that, then, if that is the case, and people do not want to be as detailed, and just and some people maybe are not as into this like we are, what do you think are a few key ones
Yeah.
that people should keep, at least on a, say, like a basic fundamental level?
Yeah. There are, I mean, it's relatively straightforward. Like physical activity, regular physical activity. Don't eat junk. Try to stay away from the processed junk as much as possible. Eat real food. Um, get consistent good sleep, where sleep time is the same every night, and you're sleeping 7 to 8 hours, somewhere in that range, or whatever, that an amount that makes you feel refreshed rather than feeling lagging. Those are probably the pillars of it. Movement, eat real food, and sleep. Because evolutionarily, I mean, that's how we evolved. Eat real
Mhm,
food. We moved a lot, or moved more than people do, I guess, now. And sleep, right? These were the pillars of it. So um fine tuning above that, though, is where I get interested in the game. So
mhm. Yeah, and the thing here is also, so I also tend to think of things like, if I'm just looking at a very basic thing, usually if I'm doing a consulting, I say, hey, most things have a heart rate. Most things now, I think, have an HRV. Most things have sleep, and they have that breakdown of sleep. And then last but not least, which is the next topic that I'm going to get into, is breath and the respiration. And that's a curious one I'm about as well, because what I noted, it was 16. It was greater. It was less than 16, right? And that was in. Oh, sorry, greater than 16 increased all cause mortality,
yeah, but
right?
that's the only study that I know of that exists, and
Hmm.
that was in there were two groups, two different studies. Within one study, it was 76-year-olds, if I remember correctly, in one study, and then in the other part of that study was older than 80 years old. So for people at advanced ages, higher than 16 breaths per minute was associated with an increased all-cause mortality risk. Now, would that be true in younger cohorts? I don't know. But I can say that, having tracked respiratory rate, I think I have 900 days of data. I wish I went back and tracked it earlier, so, because I have 1,500 days of data with
Hmm.
resting heart rate variability, and they're all coming from the same place. So technically, I could have 600 more days of data for respiratory rate. But for me, my data is I average somewhere around 14.4, 14.3. The only times I've gone above 16 is with vaccination.
Hmm.
Uh, so, and it's very clear to see on the graph. It's like, so vaccination, immune activation, more breaths per minute while sleeping, which then raises an interesting question for people older than 75 or 76 in these studies that had respiratory rates greater than 16, and this is their consistent, this is their everyday respiratory rate.
Hmm.
Are they walking around in a state of chronic immune activation? But because of what? Is it because of poor gut barrier function? More stuff leaks into the blood, immune activation? Is it they've got a lifetime of accumulating infections that are just latent and somehow triggering an immune response? I don't know, but yeah, I think the respiratory rate is a very interesting one.
Yeah, it is. So because so mine is now, when I first started, and this is before, and my metrics dramatically improved once I started incorporating more cardiovascular activity. Now, of course, I mean, I didn't need to run 20 something miles now, but just start running, and for me, biking or something. And what I noticed, I was at around 18,
Oh wow.
and then all of a sudden, I'm between now about 16.5 to maybe 17.3.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times, for me, I don't know, mouth taping helped. So I started sleeping with mouth taping. Also, caffeine intake is a big one. And then also, I think I'm just a high strung guy.
So wait, the caffeine, so if so I drink green tea every day, which has caffeine in it, and that's first thing in the morning, and then I don't I if I drink it past noon, I'm fried, like I can't go to sleep.
Mhm.
Are you having caffeine before bed Like,
I,
or
I, br- I break my rule. So I even did the genetic testing as well. So like my SNP cells show, so I'm a slow metabolizer.
hmm,
And so I really need to stop caffeine probably around 11 a.m.
hmm.
typically. And then also exercising late at night sometimes, even a couple hours because I get in the sauna as well.
Yeah.
So,
So I've completely changed my approach to all that, even in terms of eating, how
mhm,
close to bedtime. So it used to be where I'd fast and just do one meal a day and eat basically when I got home at 6 o'clock, from 6 to 8 or 9 o'clock. So
mhm,
a really short eating window. But because I'm eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, and I'm not vegan, but my diet is mostly plant based, I'd wake up, many times during the night, to use the bathroom, and then I'd feel terrible, the next day because my sleep quality was bad. So I completely flipped that. It's where I'm now.
mhm,
I'm eating the majority of my calories, by 1 o'clock, from 5 in the morning to like 1 o'clock, and then I try to stay away from water and have very little food in terms of calories after around one, maybe about 100 calories from 1 to 8 or 9 o'clock. And for me, that helps with sleep quality. But in terms of the caffeine story, you can actually track that. Like you can log, did I have caffeine today, and put it in, put it in a spreadsheet and track that with your respiratory rate,
mhm,
or even any part of your diet. If you're tracking all aspects of your diet, it may not be caffeine. You can look at it, or even, exercise time. Like, did I exercise in the afternoon, 3 hours before bed? You can put that in a file and track it with respiratory rate, and then look at correlations to try to identify, which is impacting it the most. So, I mean, I'd bet it's probably eating relatively late, close to bed, and
probably.
exercise relatively
Mhm,
close to bed. But I don't know though. You'd have to do that
mhm,
experiment and switch it to earlier and see if it changed, right? And now imagine if having a relatively higher respiratory rate is potentially bad for health in younger people, not
mhm,
just in older people. If making simple switches to when you exercise and when you eat, or when you drink caffeine, flips your respiratory rate from 16 to 17 now down into like 15,
mhm,
that's a huge gain,
mhm.
so potential gain if it's,
'Cause I imagine then that my HRV still is gonna improve even more,
yeah,
and my resting heart rate, and my resting heart rate is already typically probably mid-40s, about
cool.
45,
Right.
45 to 50,
How about
50.
heart rate variability?
Oh, 50, about 55 to 70 in that range, and I
Nice.
know HRV is very it's a lot of genetics involved in that as well.
Not necessarily.
No? You
I
don't think
see.
so?
I I see a lot of people say nonsense. I put
Mhm,
the nonsense in quotes, like HRV is individualistic.
mhm,
It's an individual number, which to me says my number is not what everybody else's number. But this is nonsense. Like there's a Fitbit study that I commonly cite in many of my videos where they looked at 8.2 million people for heart rate variability, and it declines during aging. The highest values in 20-year-olds with a median of about 80, and in 60-year-olds with a median of about 40, or even a little bit less than that. And if you extrapolate it further, it continues to decline during aging, up until you get to about 80-year-olds. And then it kind of changes because in two very small studies, 80-year-olds and in centenarians, so 100-year-olds, they had higher than expected heart rate variability when considering that age-related decline. So heart rate variability can be improved, but for me, I look at it within the context of both. I don't. So when people say, "Oh, my resting heart rate is 45," yeah, but you could have a resting heart rate of 45, and if your heart rate variability is 40, you're not doing great. And
mhm.
especially resting heart rate increases until about 50, and then it declines. So youthful levels can look the same as really aged levels, but when you consider the heart rate variability data that your highest values are found in youth, low resting heart rate, high heart rate variability, this is youth. Low resting heart rate, low heart rate variability, relatively low. That's the age phenotype. But all of that data can be improved. When I started, my heart rate variability was 48 to
Mhm.
50, somewhere in that range 4 years ago. And now my average is about 59, 60 for heart rate variability, 45 for resting heart rate. So I've improved both of those over 4 years. So yeah, the idea that heart rate variability is individual, and I have to like, there's like a meme where, it's like a cartoon where someone's saying things like, someone said something on the internet, and, I have to resist commenting against everyone who said some nonsense.
Mhm.
Like I see that so often where someone says heart rate variability is individual, and my value is specific to me. No, it can be improved. For sure, it can be improved.
No, that's good to hear. That's good to hear because I mean, it's hard to keep up with everything. You're in the trenches. I would say you're a guy who's in the trenches. Like, deep in the trenches. So you're like one of the people that I kind of look to learn when I'm working with the people out in everyday life. And so those are just misnomers that you hear, and you don't look into every single thing, because if you see enough people, you see some people got a HRV typically around 100,
Yeah.
some people got a 50, and even if they do improve, it's going up maybe 10 points or so. So then you really start to think that confirmation bias comes in, and you think, okay, maybe it is individualistic, and genetics play a huge part of it. And so,
I,
but that's a very good point that you make though about you when you got youth and how you're going to have that, but then when you get over that 50 and how that's going to look.
Yeah. I mean, genetics probably is playing a role for sure, but when considering it declines during aging, it's a precipitous decline during aging, at least for heart rate variability. Um, so over the last 4 years, technically my data should have declined, but it hasn't. I've increased my heart rate variability over the last 4 years. Now, I don't know how high I can get it. And then, I expect to get it a little bit higher and then probably plateau. And then we'll see, can I resist any age-related decline after that? But uh, I think the answer to the story of just heart rate variability or resting heart rate is that they should be evaluated together. And I think most people, they don't. I mean, I'm putting out videos saying that and showing the data about why that should be the case, but even Whoop and other apps don't say these things,
I just read an article from them because that's what I'm using now is to Whoop, and they actually mentioned that in the HRV article. I think that's probably where I read it, where they talked about it's individualistic and it's genetic, and don't compare your numbers to somebody else's number, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
that's probably because there's a big audience, and I don't know.
Yeah, you could make that argument about, so imagine if I said glucose, my glucose is 115. And then you could say, well, that's specific to me. 115 must be optimal because that's my number. And I see that mindset a lot. Like even with the epigenetic data, I posted a video on that last week, and someone, so the Horvath data is terrible, straight out terrible, even though my other two tests are good. And someone commented, how good are these tests? Now, I've covered that in other videos. I've shown how do these things correlate with chronological age and their association with all-cause mortality risk. These aren't nonsense tests, but that the mindset is it must be the test. Or another one is, like, for example, with blood testing, someone will say, oh, my creatinine was high, which is a marker of kidney function. And they'll say, it must have been that I was dehydrated. That's why, because if I'm dehydrated, it'll be more concentrated in the plasma when it's measured. So that's why my data is higher. But that's the same mentality of that's an individual number that's specific to me, so I don't buy it. Maybe all of us have a range where, so I guess to go down that rabbit hole a little bit more, like going back to the idea of the workhorse versus what's your optimal physical activity zone. Mentally, I have the workhorse mentality, but obviously I can't do that because it'll wreck my cardiovascular fitness metrics, right? So, but then there may be other people like endurance athletes, some endurance athletes, because I know of some endurance athletes that have absolutely terrible heart rate variabilities, and they're cycling a ton a week, doing way more exercise than me, probably overtrained, chronically overtrained. But there are probably, I'd expect that the best of the best in any athletic endeavor, in any sport, have a background genetics that can tolerate very high training loads, thereby also resulting in very good fitness metrics. Whereas for most people, and even, probably the sub elite performers in a given field probably don't have those genetics. So from that perspective, there is some individual aspect to it, but that argument can be made about everything, but, so that then brings me back to it declines during aging. Relatively higher heart rate variability is found in youth. You want to make sure your data doesn't decline during aging, for heart rate variability at least, and they should be, evaluated together. So, yeah.
So let's transition to a few of the organ systems, and so because we mentioned that a couple of times. So you did a video on the kidney functioning and what's optimal. So kind of what did you learn about that?
Yeah, so it isn't just creatinine that I look at for kidney function. So also blood urea nitrogen and uric acid are two of the ones that I and they're commonly measured on a standard chem panel. So it isn't just creatinine, which is used to estimate the kidney function using the eGFR. And some people have criticized that that's not the best marker. You can use cystatin C. There is some truth in that because creatinine, which is used to estimate kidney function, is proportional to muscle mass. So people who have very large muscle mass can have very, a lot of creatinine in their muscle, and that will be proportional to what you find in the blood. So it may give basically a false positive in terms of kidney function. It may show you have an EGFR that's actually worse than what it is. So in that case, and for people who are very old, older than 80 or so, cystatin C can get around that because it's not proportional to muscle mass like creatinine. So for the creatinine story, the goal is to keep it above 90 in terms of EGFR. That's what the all-cause mortality data shows. Relatively higher EGFR is found in youth, and that too declines during aging. But I also use, like I said, I also use a couple other metrics, like blood urine nitrogen, uric acid, which increase during aging in part because the kidney function declines during aging. So you can't pee those out of your blood as well as you should when you're young. So, but then taking a deeper dive. So sorry, Julian. So a deeper dive, because I track diet, I can investigate correlations between my diet, including macros, micronutrients, and individual foods with these blood biomarkers. And for creatinine, the strongest correlation is, for whatever reason, flax seeds. So when my flaxseed intake has been relatively high, creatinine is relatively low. But then the question is, if correlation equals causation, and I shoot for my highest flaxseed intake, does that mess up all the other biomarkers? So what's the optimal level of flax seeds that may improve my kidney function if, again, correlation equals causation, without messing up other biomarkers? So a big part of my approach isn't just to optimize kidney function. It's, trying to find that seesaw, the middle, the happy balance between the full spectrum of basically systemic physiology.
Mm-hmm. And so moving on to the lung functioning, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned lower blood pressure and then slower brain aging.
Yeah. So in that video, so lung function declines during aging. And one way that that's measured is by spirometry, where you blow into a device and that measures how forceful that you're expiring air per minute. So that ability declines during aging, mostly or in part because of decrease the musculature for your lungs. It basically we're breathing, even with vigorous exercise and huffing and puffing, that's not active lung training. So actually, when I made that video, I was comparing myself to the top 5% in terms of the highest lung function. So I used the wrong graph, but when I compare myself, even when I compare myself to the median value for my age, it isn't great. I mean, it's not, youthful value. So, and there is data showing that if you improve your lung function using the forced expiratory volume, this FEV1, by using a device that's basically a resistance trainer for your lung muscles for inspiration and or expiration, in a few studies that's been shown to reduce blood pressure. So now my blood pressure isn't terrible. It's been 120, mid 120s, over 75 around that. So, but that too is pretty close to what you'd expect for someone of my chronological age. So this goes to that idea of what are the blind spots in the biological age test. Lung function and blood pressure aren't included in the ones that I use. So I'm now tracking them. So, and then in terms of the brain aging link, people who in a study that I cited in the video, people who had blood pressures of 115/75, less than that, had the slowest rate of brain aging in the study that I cited in the video. So that raises the hypothesis: if I use a lung trainer, will that improve not only my lung function, but reduce my blood pressure and then potentially also slow brain aging? So I do have some data. I'm not ready to, this is hot off the presses. This is the inside scoop, right? But interestingly, my lung function hasn't gotten better. I bought a combined inspiratory and expiratory trainer, and not going too expensive, just, like a $60 trainer. I don't want to, I try to go the bare bones first before going to the very expensive stuff, right? So interesting, my lung function hasn't improved, using that forced expiratory volume. How forcefully can I expire air? But my blood pressure has decreased by a little bit. And that's by looking at, it's probably about 55 values before the lung trainer and probably about 20 values after the lung trainer over the past, month and a half or so. So it's a significantly different, there's a significant difference with a small but significant difference for, I think it's my diastolic blood pressure, not the systolic, but the systolic is trending down. So that would be interesting, now, so that'll get me closer to the 115/75. My average currently is somewhere like 119/73 or something like that, somewhere in that ballpark, which is an improvement. So And blood pressure goes up with age. It doesn't, or at least the systolic does. So uh, trying to optimize every organ system.
Yes, and so I mean that's closely related to heart health.
Yeah.
And we've been so have you I had a talk with a guy recently, and it's what's the name of this test? And I was going to do it at some point. Oh, CAC. Have you had a CAC?
That's on my list. That's on my short list. I want to get that done sooner rather than later.
Me too, because
Yeah.
that was one of the things that when you look into endurance athletes and you see that, because a lot of the endurance athletes don't really age that gracefully.
Yep.
So I wanted to go ahead and get a baseline number while I'm fresh off at the very beginning of the journey, and then see as the years accumulate.
I'd recommend it. I think it's an important one to measure.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, and another thing that which I have to look into this more is oral microbiome. I did
yeah,
not know that there was a testing for it,
yeah, yeah.
and so
Yep.
I'm going to have to look into it myself, and I might have to like include this, for other people as well. So what about that?
Yeah, so that could potentially be a weak spot in my approach too. So my mom, most of her teeth fell out when like she was in her teens, and now some of that may be genetic. I don't know, but her mom, my grandmother, worked in a candy shop, so I'm betting that my mom ate just a ton of candy when she was younger, and then the sugar in the candy is fermented by the bacteria in the mouth and make acid. Acid rots the teeth. So I don't know if that's the case with me or not. I haven't had cavities in a while, or major cavities in a while. I had one, that I had filled recently, but nonetheless, oral microbiome testing hasn't been commercially available until relatively recently, and the bacteria in the mouth are related to not just gum inflammation or periodontitis,
Mhm,
but it's or cavity formation, but they're also associated with extra oral conditions. I mean, they've been found in atherosclerotic plaques, in pneumonia. They're associated with ammonia, a couple of autoimmune diseases. So yeah, I think it's huge to and you won't catch that in a biological age test, or even by looking at a blood testing. You won't catch that potentially until it's too late, right?
mhm.
So I brush every day, I floss every day. There was a study that came out a few years ago. I put it on my blog about people who flossed every day before bed had a reduced all-cause mortality risk. So since I saw that study, I've been flossing religiously for a few years. So
Yeah.
yeah, but so I started making my own mouthwash in part because what's commercially available, many of them have a pH less than 5 in order to maintain shelf life. But that's important because when the pH in the mouth goes below 5.5, that's active cavity formation can happen. So I started making my own homemade mouthwash a few years ago and putting things in it like xylitol, which reduces it's can reduce cavity formation in part by reducing the bacteria. One of them, Streptococcus mutans, which is can impact cavity formation. So in my oral microbiome, I don't have any of those bacteria. I don't know if it's because of xylitol or not, but anyway, the long story short is by tracking it, I have a couple of bacteria which are linked with periodontitis, and those bacteria are also related to bad breath. They're related to a few extra oral conditions, which aren't good news. So then I go into the published literature to see what can kill these buggers off, right? And it's figuring out which thing can actually, it's another biohacking experiment, which thing can kill those buggers off. So I've done 3 oral microbiome tests. I sent my last one off a couple of weeks ago. We'll see if one of my recent experiments killed off any of these buggers. And if it did, great. I'll get an improvement in my oral microbiome. But I want to make sure, and it may be where I've gotten into the game too late. Close to 50. I should have been doing this in my 20s and optimizing my or even younger from birth. Optimizing my oral microbiome and everything else. But it's never too late to start, right? So
That's true. I mean, I didn't even think about it. I mean, I do the brushing and the flossing, and I mean, for me, it hit close to home because I actually a lot of times your teeth health and can is very closely related to your heart health. And I saw with my father, he started to really have a bunch of issues with his mouth, and lo and behold, he already had issues with his heart, but that even started to dramatically um, expedite, go faster. And the thing I hate was not being a louder advocate and telling them, "Hey, he's having oral problems. We need to check his heart and all of that," because that's not really common, unless you are in the literature. And so at
Yeah.
that time, I was in the literature because I was trying to figure out stuff for him. That's a whole nother story. But yeah, unless you read the literature, you're not going to really see that these two things are closely related.
Yeah. Along those lines, so I went to the when I go to the dentist, for a cleaning every 6 months, and they don't know anything about microbiology in the mouth. Literally
Hmm.
nothing. They're just mechanics, scraping stuff off my teeth and filling cavities. When I start talking about oral microbiome, they don't know what a quote unquote good oral microbiome or oral bacteria composition looks like, or bad. Like, now, granted, the field is still evolving; it's still a new field,
Hmm.
but they're not reading any of that. Like, so why isn't oral microbiology a form or incorporated into standard dentistry? They're definitely related. There are bacteria that can cause tooth decay, bacteria that are found in gum disease and bad breath. Like, it's anyway. So yeah.
So I'm thinking that if we're going to have that, then eventually we're going to have oral. I've seen it, but I don't know how effective they are. I've seen oral probiotics.
Yeah.
I
So
don't
then
know. I don't know how effective they are though.
so that's another biohacking experiment, because that kind of go into the individual thing, right?
Hmm.
Everybody may not have the same oral microbiome that would need the same oral probiotics. And then if you take an oral probiotic, can it even live in your mouth? Like,
Hmm.
the conditions in your mouth have to be, hospitable for that given oral probiotic. And then which probiotic do you give? Is it, so bacteria are like an ecosystem. So, is it the biggest tree in the forest?
Hmm.
Do you supplement with the biggest tree in the forest, or do you supplement with the little trees that may not really have an impact on your overall oral microbiome health, right? So, and then how much? What's the dose you should use, right? So, I'm kind of the anti the probiotic story, even for the gut, for many of those reasons. Unless there's a specific need where you see that this is the microbiome in health, and this is where your levels are. Now, first, I'd try different things, like in a mouthwash or through diet, that can potentially allow the growth of that bacteria. So you kind of fix the underlying problem. But then if that doesn't work, obviously the other strategy would be, okay, maybe you can replenish that quote unquote healthy bacterium. And just along those lines, there are studies where, for example, in a cancer animal model, the mice had reduced muscle mass. So they sequenced the gut microbiome, and they found that one lactobacillus strain was dramatically lower when compared with the normal mice. So they thought, all right, if this has anything to do with muscle mass in this cancer animal model, if we replenish that, what'll happen? So when they replenished it, it actually increased muscle mass, significantly increased muscle mass back to where the controls had. So I prefer the more targeted approach where, you see what a quote unquote healthy state is, and then you see where your levels are. And then, you can either supplement with it or try to get your body to make more of it. Whereas
Hmm.
I lean towards the how can I get my body to make more of it approach. So
Yeah. So what's in the mouthwash? I know you said xylitol.
yeah, so xylitol, peppermint oil. So these quote unquote essential oils, which I think is a
Hmm.
really stupid name, because why are they essential? Where does that come from? It's
I
just
think that was just a marketing ploy, and I
mm,
and I didn't figure that out, or at least I don't. I think it is because um, essential usually means it's necessary.
yeah.
And I mean, peppermint oil is good, but I don't think it's like a matter of life and death if I don't get it or not.
Yeah. So xylitol, peppermint oil. Peppermint oil has been shown to, in at least in vitro studies, to kill off P. gingivalis,
Hmm.
which again is associated with poor oral health and extra oral health too. So mine was 0.2%, which on my last test went down to zero. So I don't know if it's because of the peppermint oil or it's just natural variation. I don't know. So xylitol, peppermint oil, and then for the second test, I started to add potassium nitrate because of a
Okay.
paper that was published that showed that nitrate may act as a prebiotic that enables the growth of nitrate reducing bacteria in the mouth, which are quote unquote good bacteria. And also there was a reduction in quote unquote bad bacteria in the mouth, which halitosis linked with halitosis, gum inflammation, all that. So when I did that experiment, I didn't actually increase, so having nitrate in my mouthwash didn't actually stimulate more nitrate reducing bacteria in my mouth, which the reason for that is probably because I'm already on a high nitrate diet. So when you
Hmm.
eat nitrate containing foods, there's two effects. One is the direct effect of the nitrate when it's in your mouth, and two, when you eat the food, it's absorbed into the bloodstream, the nitrate, and then that's secreted by the salivary glands into the mouth, enabling the growth of nitrate reducing bacteria. So, I detailed in my videos, and I'm on like 1,800 milligrams of nitrate per day. And what's recommended is for my body weight is something like 300 milligrams per day. So I'm already on a high nitrate diet. So that might not be the road to go. So I had nitrate. I had 4 grams per liter in the mouthwash. I reduced that to 2. And this goes beyond the data. I had like these white lines on the insides of my cheeks. It's called linea alba. And then after I added nitrate into the mouthwash, they went away. So I don't know what that did, but I want to keep the nitrate in the mouthwash, even if it's not enabling growth of more nitrate reducing bacteria, or at least in a smaller dose. So I cut it from 4 to 2. And then around the time I had a cavity, I noticed that I had some kind of a smell going on back there too. Now the cavity got fixed, but the smell didn't get fixed. So I went on an experimental spree with every quote unquote essential oil you can think of. One of them worked. One of them actually, but it's hard to get. I have to order it from India. It doesn't exist here in the United States for whatever reason. But when I used that, it killed it off pretty quickly. And I sent my oral microbiome right around that time. So if I reduce the couple of bacteria that I think it may have affected, that'll be interesting. But it's a hard quote unquote essential oil to get, and so.
Wow. I got a lot to read on that, because I know very little about the oral microbiome. And the only thing I really knew, like I said, about the oral was that it's connected to heart health and everything. But
yeah,
wow.
I've got a video series. I've got 2 videos on that. I'd highly recommend it.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check that out. Yeah, because there's so much to learn. So a couple other things that I was thinking about is I think we talked about cholesterol a few years ago. And so have you got any new things with cholesterol?
So the cholesterol story is probably one of the most debatable things of all biomarkers. So you'll have like the vegan crowd who have very low cholesterol, less than 160, who will say, oh, this is what's optimal because this is my data. And then you'll have the other side of the fence where the published literature shows having cholesterol levels in around the 220 to 229 range. These are in very large epidemiological studies, like the one I'm thinking of. It was 12 million or 16 million people, very large study. So basically like a U-shaped curve where 220 to 229 was lowest risk. And then as you went below that, risk started to increase, and above that, actually, risk started to increase. So then what about the people who have low total cholesterol? What's going on there? And the study even broke it down by age group. And it was like at every age, almost every age group, I think, except for 18 to 34-year-olds, were having relatively lower total cholesterol was associated with an increased all-cause mortality risk. So for that story, I think what's instructive is looking at how total cholesterol, which is mostly LDL, changes during aging. So LDL is relatively low in youth, and then it peaks at about midlife, 50 to 60 years, and then it declines. So in the study that I'm referencing in my mind, it's also this 16 million people study. Their age range only went up to 88 years. So if you extrapolate in studies older than 88 years, very old people, centenarians, super centenarians, can have total cholesterol levels that are, again, 170 that look like youth. So is it youth? So it's the same dichotomy again of the resting heart rate story. Is 170 and older people representative of youth, or is it representative of aged, right? And actually in 80-year-olds, there are a few studies that have shown that 80-year-olds who have relatively higher total cholesterol is associated with a lower all-cause mortality risk than lower, which suggests that for the people that for people at advanced age that have relatively low total cholesterol, that's a bad thing. It isn't representative of youth. But what about the people that have low total cholesterol that are already 20, 30, 40 years old? And you have the increased all-cause mortality risk that also with relatively low cholesterol. So unfortunately, there isn't much published data on the low cholesterol the low cholesterol story side. But there is one study in 70-ish-year-olds where they looked at total cholesterol levels less than 160. And in conjunction with other biomarkers that were youthful, like having albumin higher than 38 grams per liter, I think, and an HDL higher than 47. That's important because albumin declines during aging and HDL also declines during aging. Mm-hmm. So when you think that, when you go back to the aged phenotype, someone that's got a low total cholesterol, a total cholesterol of 170 and a relatively low albumin and a relatively low HDL, that's the aged phenotype. But in the study that I referenced in a few of my videos, if your total cholesterol is relatively low, less than 160, I think, but your albumin is high, relatively high, and your HDL is relatively high, that's the youthful phenotype, because that's what you'd expect to find in young people. So then the question is now the big issue then would be, investing that hypothesis in these very large studies, 12 million, 16 million people. As far as I know, I haven't seen it. And I've done huge deep dives in these all-cause mortality studies that look at either LDL or total cholesterol. They're adjusting for things like glucose and diabetes and, even blood pressure, but never for other biomarkers representative of youth, like albumin or HDL, or sometimes HDL, but not albumin. So, so where was I going last with that story? Yeah. So that's the low total cholesterol story. I think in the context of other biomarkers that are youthful, that's the youthful phenotype. But if your albumin's low and kidney function is low, liver enzymes are very low, which can also be found in the H phenotype, what does the whole system look like, right? But adding some confusion to that story is it may not be, well, I shouldn't say may not be, but ApoB, which is what the non-HDL containing cholesterol, so LDL, lipoprotein A, VLDL, these all contain ApoB. ApoB is thought to be a better marker of cardiovascular disease relative to the individual, right? So how much ApoB is circulating, right? So then that too, it's like, what's the all-cause mortality data? And for that, there are very few studies. Is my risk for all-cause mortality better with a relatively low ApoB? For cardiovascular disease, better with a relatively low ApoB. But what's the full context? Maybe it's going to be better for cancer risk or respiratory disease. So the most direct evidence is going to be that coronary artery calcium score, right? So, for example, too, I have lipoprotein A. So my LDL is relatively low. I'm in that low total cholesterol boat, but my other biomarkers are youthful. So I might be at an increased all-cause mortality risk, at least based on the published epidemiological studies. But as a part of that, heart disease and adverse cardiovascular outcomes run in my family. My dad's brother died at 51 after he had a stroke in his 40s. My dad's father died at 67 from heart disease. So I have elevated, well, I shouldn't say elevated, it's on the border of being elevated, lipoprotein A, which is in the LDL subfamily. So even that, which is thought to be, again, going back to the individual and genetically determined, by tracking it so often with, almost every blood test over the last few years and tracking with diet, I see the dietary approach that actually can split my lipoprotein A in half, potentially reducing my risk, but it can make my other biomarkers worse. So the long story short is I think the cholesterol story is probably the most debatable biomarker. And I hope that's not a weakness in my data. I've rationalized in videos that, the youthful versus the age phenotype. And also when considering that heart disease runs in my family, for me, it makes sense to aim towards the lower end of the range. And also when considering that high total cholesterol in my data is associated with a lot of other biomarkers going in the wrong direction. Like I can increase it easily through diet. I can go from 120 total cholesterol to 180, 190 just by making dietary change without a problem. But does my overall biochemical profile, glucose and everything else, how does that look with relatively high cholesterol? So far, not good. But I should say too, I'm open to the idea of maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe I do have to go high, increase it a little bit while not messing up the other biomarkers. But for now, I'm not in that boat.
Yeah, I mean, that's the good thing about this world is that most of us are not really tied to any idea. We have a very common objective. We're all aiming for that Hayflick limit and to pass that.
Yeah.
And so whatever is the best way to get there, that's what we're all going to do. And so that's the good thing. And because just like it's just been 2 years, and there's been so many changes even since those 2 years. And so that's why it's a very interesting thing. And I don't, personally, I don't know. I don't know about the cholesterol thing. I don't know. Because like you said, I saw that study where, once the older people had the higher levels of cholesterol, actually were living longer than the people with lower.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that makes sense though, because so cholesterol can act to as an aid to the immune system. For example, it can bind to things like lipopolysaccharide, which is it's found in the bacterial outer membrane. and it can leak into the blood, and that can, so anyway, cholesterol, certain LDL can bind to lipopolysaccharide, and basically target it for excretion. So which would aid the immune system. Now, immune function declines during aging. So to me, it makes sense. Age-related immune decline. The people who have the ability to make more cholesterol, because that's what the liver is doing, they're going to live longer than people who have an age-related immune decline but can't make that cholesterol. So I understand it from that perspective, but then for me, it goes to the issue of the youthful phenotype. Low total cholesterol is found in youth. Is that also associated with many other youthful biomarkers? I should say, along the lines of I'm open to increasing my cholesterol levels a little bit. One reason for that is because cholesterol is used to make androgens, which precipitously decline during aging. Like in some of the metabolomic studies that I'm a part of, and in published studies, when you look at metabolites that decline during aging, it's easy to say one metabolite here, one metabolite there, but as a group, there are like 20 androgens. So progesterone, pregnenolone, DHEA sulfate in that area, androstenedione stuff. And now these may seem, like big chemical names, but the long story short is that the androgens decline during aging. So, that's a part of what may contribute to less muscle mass and all the other functions of androgens, quality of life. So I started measuring one of them, DHEA sulfate, which is the most abundant androgen, at least for men. And although in youth, I measured it a couple of times in 2005. So, 17, 18 years ago, I had youthful levels, but now my levels are what you'd expect to find in a 50-year-old, right? So is that because my low total cholesterol, which is used to make the androgens, I don't have enough? So I actually did an experiment increasing my dietary cholesterol, which is in my data, it's the strongest correlation with a higher blood cholesterol. So I increased my dietary cholesterol, and then I looked to see if I saw changes in my DHEA sulfate, and it didn't change the numbers, but my blood levels of cholesterol didn't increase during those 4 tests with a higher dietary cholesterol. So I'm on it.
You think you'll have to supplement with DHA?
I look at that as the easy way out. I want to find, if possible, how I can stimulate my body to make more of it. Because if I'm taking it, I'm never going to improve adrenal function because it's mostly produced in the adrenal gland. And I may have some age-related adrenal gland decline. But if I can, kick my adrenal gland by some combination, and I'm measuring DHEA sulfate at every test. And what sucks is, I did it by finger prick over 16 tests, and nothing in my diet stood out as being significant to impact it, which 16 tests, you think that's a lot of data. Now, in venipuncture, which is a gold standard, even though those data agreed mostly, the finger prick test versus venipuncture and I put that data in the video, I'm blood testing, this year 7 times. So to get 16 blood tests, it's going to take me 2+ years to get 6. So, and then if I'm not going to have anything significant correlated with 16 blood tests, this may be a 3 to 5 year journey of trying to optimize DHEA sulfate. So, part of this is having enough data to be able to, to really impact it, right? So,
speaking of, the supplement way or the dietary way, a big one with that is spermidine, which has caught my interest a lot, and then also l-ergothioneine.
Yeah.
And in those two, like I watched your spermidine video, and the amount of spermidine to get that from a dietary, I think I'm lazy.
It's not that much though. It's only 10 milligrams per day. I don't remember how many mushrooms that you would need.
I like mushrooms, but I don't know if I like them as much as you do.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting too, besides the spermidine and besides the ergothioneine, they're a really rich concentrated source of niacin. So niacin can impact, and I've taken very high dose niacin in the past to reduce lipoprotein A.
Did you have the flushes? Did you have the flush?
Yeah, I do. Even when I take the non-flush, it in high doses, it messes up my liver enzymes. So I get favorable effects on the lipid panel, but it kills my liver enzymes, like it doubles them. So, but when considering that it positively impacted my lipid panel, relatively high niacin in my data is significantly correlated with a lot more biomarkers going in the right direction than wrong. So mushrooms are a rich source of niacin. I mean, my niacin intake is about 2.5 times the RDA, and mushrooms heavily contribute to that. So For me, it goes beyond the spermidine and the ergothioneine. Niacin actually may have the biggest, because niacin even ties into the NAD story, which that everybody's all over that. Whether or not that'll be true, people will see.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about that? Valuable, overhyped, or just about right on the machine?
Yeah. So NAD levels do decline during aging, but this goes back to the supplement versus, what's the diet and activity and even targeted supplementation approach that optimizes your NAD levels. So I see everybody going after the supplements and assuming that that's going to maximize health and or lifespan. So in a metabolomic study that looked at centenarians versus their offspring, so 99-year-olds versus 67-year-olds, so nicotinamide riboside, it's found in the body. So if the NAD story or the NR story, which would expect to have higher levels of NAD, if that's a part of longevity, you'd expect to see higher NR levels in centenarians. So it's like 1% higher when compared with the younger age group. And there are other things like glutathione that are up in centenarians, which shouldn't be up because glutathione declines during aging. So in terms of the NAD story, I'm not anti-NAD, that whole pathway by any means, but there may be other stuff like glutathione that may have a potential bigger impact. But is it a good idea to make sure your age-related, the age-related decline, you slow and prevent that? For sure. Will supplementing the death out of it, is that the best way? I don't know. If I measure my NAD, and I actually had a company reach out to me to have my NAD levels measured, what's optimal? Am I going to go by what a company says this is the normal range because this is the normal range based on the people that have used our product? That's an arbitrary sample, right? It's like selection bias. But what's the all-cause mortality data? What's an optimal range based on many studies? It doesn't exist. So what should I shoot for, right?
Yeah.
Now
see that's a tough thing, because unless you're just really lacking in it, then you might feel a boost, maybe with energy.
Yeah.
But if you're someone maybe like us, where energy is already good enough, and we're not deficient in it by any means, but we're looking for what's optimal, what's going above that, right? That's the thing you don't know yet.
Yeah. So there is an answer to that data without the published studies, but it takes a lot of data to get there. It's, I can look at, the assumption would be whatever my NAD levels are, if they start off quote unquote low relative to whatever the reference range is, the arbitrary reference range, if I increase them, I can then look at all my other blood biomarkers that I'm tracking. So you'd have to track NAD in conjunction with your other blood biomarkers. And the hypothesis would be, if you increase your NAD levels, you'd expect to see some positive impact on all of the other biomarkers, because NAD, you want it to be intracellular. You want it to be affecting your cell health and function, which should affect some organ systems. Which ones, I don't know. The NAD requirements it's not the same across all tissue types, right? So that is one way to do it, by doing a biomarker versus biomarker analysis. But the NAD test that I'm thinking of, it's like a $600 test. I can't imagine a company's going to let me use a $600 test, 7 times a year, costing them $4,200. I don't know. Maybe I could do it. Maybe I could do it and then promote it on my channel. But for regular people to do that experiment, you can't do it and price them out.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yeah, and that's the thing. Because I think of I'm thinking for when you're working with someone and you have all these things in utility belt, right? But like what order? What's the sequencing that we need to get them in, right?
Yeah.
And for that, I just think there's known things before that, before you get to that stage. So for me now, what I see a lot of people skipping steps. It's kind of what it seems to me. A lot of people were skipping steps.
I don't think they're skipping steps on purpose. I just think there isn't a roadmap. Like, for example, most people will say, "Oh, my glucose is this, my lipid panel is this, my triglyceride to HDL ratio is this," and then when you or at least when I do, when I push them further, all right, what's your albumin? What's your red blood cells? What's your creatinine? What are your liver enzymes? The conversation stops. I don't hear from them again. So most people, I think, are focused on metabolic health. So the glucose and lipid panel would be under the metabolic health category. But what's the full systemic view, right? So that's where I see that's something I'm going to keep shouting from the rooftops. Is the space needs to go beyond the metabolic markers and focus on as many organ systems as possible.
Yeah. Well, I think metabolic health it's very marketable.
Yeah.
And it's easier to paint a picture because you can tie that with weight. You can tie that with physical appearance. And so that just goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
It's harder to say like albumin. And I mean, look, you got me eating carrots.
If it works, if it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah, you got me eating carrots. Ever since then, you got me eating carrots.
So what are your albumin levels? Has it affected your?
Uh, a little bit, yeah, a little bit. I don't remember off the top of my head,
Hmm.
but it did make improvements.
All right, nice, 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 nice. It doesn't work for everyone. I've seen, a husband and wife team where the husband, it does, his albumin isn't affected by more beta carotene, but the
Mhm.
wife, that correlation, over many blood tests seems to be true. So, in terms of the metabolic health story, I had something that I was going to say about that. Damn. Anyway, yeah,
But yeah, we're getting over a little of the mark, and I want to be cognizant of your time. Probably one of the last things is, we've been rapid fire all over the human body, and I'm sure some people listen to this now, or you're gonna come back to it and be like, okay, where the hell should I start? And
yeah,
so let's think of like blood panels. I think that's a pretty easy start. People can sometimes go to their doctor, or they can just order from what's it called? There's different places you can get it. You don't even have to go to your doctor, I think now,
yep.
because there's different finger pricking tests, and then sometimes if you work with people, they can order it for you. So that's a very easily accessible thing. That's not $600. I mean, I have no problem with the $600 thing. I think it's cool. I think it's useful, but I just don't think it's the first thing. So
Yeah.
with that said, what do you think are some good blood panels?
Yeah. So I start off with the basics, the
Hmm.
things that have been studied for 50 to 100 plus years, which is the standard chemistry panel uh, uh, and the CBC, right?
Hmm.
So that test alone is just $35, and you're getting information on your kidneys, your liver, immune cells, going back to albumin, red blood cells. You're getting a whole bunch of information. Glucose, glucose and lipids will be included on that, depending on where you get the CBC in combination with the standard chem panel. Quest has them as separate tests, but other places like LabCorp have it as one test. So you get all that information. So I'd start there because you're getting multiple organ systems, information about multiple organ systems in one shot. And then, I try to get more specific. I add inflammation. So I add high sensitivity C-reactive protein. But even then, that's just one marker of inflammation. It's possible to, it's possible that could be good, but then other inflammation markers maybe not. So I'm missing out by not measuring them all. What I was going to go back to for metabolic health.
Hmm.
So I've seen blood test data where someone has good metabolic health, where glucose and lipid panel looks good, but then other stuff is haywire. Like,
Hmm.
so it's possible to have good metabolic health and have your immune cells, like your white blood cells, be 11, which is way too high, which to me, is crazy. Like, because the assumption is, to go into a little bit deeper, some people say to me, they'll say, what are the most important markers? Like, you shouldn't score each of these markers equally. There may be some that are driving the ship, which goes back to the ecosystem reference. What's the big tree in the forest? So for that, many people say, oh, metabolic health, that's the big tree in the forest. But like I said, I see people with good metabolic health that can have, haywire other biomarkers. So, if you ignore the other biomarkers, you're going to think your data is fantastic because the metabolic health is good, which is great. Don't get me wrong. It's fantastic to have great metabolic health. But can we measure as many organ systems as possible? So CBC, mentioning everything that I did, but then that has blind spots because it doesn't include lung function. So getting a cheap spirometer and measuring that, or maybe not a cheap one and getting something really good that can measure your lung function. Blood pressure, I think, is a huge one. That's been studied forever. And there's so much a wealth of data on blood pressure. So that's a huge one. And I'm actually kind of lazy about it. I do it 3 times a week. Technically, I could do it 7 days a week.
Man, that's
But
better than me. That's better than me. I don't even think about blood pressure. I mean, I
yeah,
should, but I just assume it's good.
yeah, same here, right? Until I started, where do I lay on the chart, the aging chart, and then I was like, oh man, this is what you'd expect for someone of my chronological age, and
Hmm.
that really grinds my gears. I hate having, someone say, oh, it's good for your age. No, I want to be good for the most youthful age.
Yeah, I
So
hate that. Yeah, that's probably the worst thing that people like us hate to hear. It's like, for your age,
yeah,
this is pretty average or pretty good. I'm like,
yeah,
oh man, I'm not doing a good job.
yeah. But so the standard chem panel, this the basic blood chemistry panel, but tracking that many times, we can't assume that one test a year is going to be representative of the whole year. So, then it becomes, how often do you test? Do you test once a month, every 2 months? What's a good testing regimen? And that goes back to the individual approach. I have clients that, every 3 months. I have clients that do it every month, every 2 months, every 6 months. For me, it's 7 times a year is what I like. So the more the better, though. And with the finger prick testing, I mentioned this in a video, like I said, and we mentioned it here too. 16 blood tests, I got that in 2 months with finger prick, whereas it will take me 2+ years to do it by venipuncture. So the finger prick test, assuming that they all relate to the venipuncture, may be the future of this whole thing, because some biomarkers don't really look the same by the finger prick, and whereas others do. So the long story short is, test as many, the standard chem panel with the CBC will get you multiple organ systems. And I would start tracking that from youth, and then intervening as soon as you start to see data going in the wrong direction in terms of aging and all-cause mortality risk. And then the question is, so if you're tracking your data for 60, 80, 100 years, and you've rigorously worked at optimizing all these markers of systemic and organ health, how much of a lifespan gain do you get? And this goes, assuming that you're eating real food, I'm not to say never junk food, but very rare or occasional, just you want to quote unquote enjoy life, whether it's wine or, junk or whatever it may be. Right. So that's, Jack LaLanne used to say, eat real food and exercise, but taking that a step above, if we rigorously track all these metrics, how much of a lifespan gain will we get? Or will we get a lifespan gain? I can't imagine that we won't, but there's no data on that. No published study exists in animal models or in humans that has used this approach as a means for extending lifespan. Because the question is, how do you do it? We know these things change in mice, there are age-related changes in every organ system, but what drugs are you going to give them that's going to improve it? And so, and titrating diet, they're on a standardized diet, right? So, will it work? We'll see, right? But I can't imagine that it won't.
Yeah, and if I want to be, when I'm being super optimistic about it, it's like I have an uncle that's like 100 years old.
Nice.
He knows nothing. He knows nothing about this. Nothing about this world at all. He's made it to 100. So I like to at least think that you can at least get to 100. I can at least get to 100 with all the information I have. Yeah. I can't control disasters or anything like that. But like just living, I can do everything in my power to at least get to 100. And then those extra 20 years, there's technology and different things like that. And then the other 100, I don't know yet. But in my head is I rather shoot really high. So I got 215 in my head. I don't know how or anything, but at least makes life exciting. And it circles all the way back to what we talked about at the very beginning of why we do these kind of things when you don't have to.
So for me, my dad is the longest lived man in my family, and he's currently 80. So I don't know that I get you've got some longevity.
So my father passed around 60, and then my grandfather, both my grandfathers were 77.
Oh,
but
so if you take the average, yeah, maybe not 100, but still better than me. Better than me.
I like it. It's like a competition. It's just like this is just another sport to me, right?
Nice.
And so I look at it that way. And for a lot of part, looking at my genes, I have like sports car genes, very athletic and all that. It's just that there's not a huge margin for error. There's some people where like they treat their bodies like crap and everything, but they're just plowing ahead. They have no issues still. For me, it's not like that. It's like a sports car. You got to really take care of it. But if you take care of it, it's going to perform well.
Same. Yeah. Dwight Howard is a notorious candy eater. Yeah. There are videos him talking about he's eating candy, like candy bars and Skittles all day, every day. So, and he's ripped and huge, right? So, in terms of the number, I don't know how long of the lifespan gain. I don't know what I all I know is the record is 122 years. I want to get to at least 123. If not, whatever the maximum my genetics will allow. Now, in terms of what to do, that could be a whole nother conversation, because I've got so much fun stuff in my mind that I don't know that I'm going to have enough time to do it all in the next 70 plus years. So, we can go into astrophysics and intergalactic travel and Alcubierre drives, I got a whole bunch of stuff in my mind. So
yeah, I mean, that's one of the main reasons why stay healthy and all this as much as possible, because there's so many things to experience. Like, so that's why, like, I like to think of this, like, even at 36, this is just my adolescence. This is just getting started.
Yeah.
just getting started.
Same. Yep.
So adolescence is until 55. So you're still adolescence. We'll
Well,
include you.
so the maximum, right? 122-year maximum lifespan. So
Yeah.
technically, I'll be middle-aged at 61.
Yeah.
But then the fun start. I don't know if it's fun, but I'm being.
I think it's fun. I mean, I know a guy. I think he's about 65, 66. His VO2 max is out of a 33-year-old. He's a machine.
Nice.
So like, you got those people like that are doing it. So there's no reason not to think you can.
So there are plenty of like elite bodybuilders that got to around 70 that still look youthful, like physically, mentally, but then there can be a precipitous decline after 70. So when I say that's when the fun starts, you know, I'm probably just like you in this way. I'm very competitive.
Mhm.
And in this case, the competition is me against me. So
Yeah.
okay, aging's gonna beat my you know what after 70. All right, let's see. Can I science the out of aging? I don't know.
Yeah.
Or I'll die trying. That's where we're going with that.
Perfect way to end this.
Yeah.
Conquer aging or die trying.
You
And
got
so YouTube channel is the same name. And is that the best place to direct them?
Yeah, that works.
Yeah.
That works.
Well, you got to subscribe to his YouTube channel. I say Michael is one of the people that teaches all the other people that are out shouting and doing all the content that you see on various different platforms. They learn from people like Michael, because Michael's in the trenches every day doing this. And so Michael helps make my job easier because I learned from him.
Cool.
So with that said, everyone, stay awesome, be limitless. And as always, go be the CEO of your health and life. Bye-bye.